Hello to everyone who has joined a few minutes early. We'll begin our webinar on the state of inclusive business at the top of the hour in just a couple of minutes, so please stand by. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those who have joined us for a webinar on the results of the first State of Inclusive Business Survey conducted by GlobeScan and Business Call to Action. We'll give people who are a minute or so late joining just a few minutes to connect, and then we'll get underway. So stay with us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a webinar on the results of the first survey on the state of inclusive business conducted by Business Call to Action with partners at GlobeScan. We welcome everyone across many time zones from around the world. We're very thrilled to be here today to provide our first reveal of the findings of a survey of sustainability and inclusive business practitioners from around the world. We have a unique and wonderful group of esteemed panelists with us, and we'll begin with a brief introduction. My name is Whan. I'm a director at GlobeScan, which is a strategy and insights consultancy focused on sustainability, purpose, and corporate reputation. And we've worked closely with Business Call to Action over the past several months to conduct this survey. And with that, I'd like to hand it to Paula Pelaez, who is head of Business Call to Action, hosted at the UNDP in Istanbul. Paula, could you say hello and tell us a little bit about Business Call to Action for those who do not know? And we're all curious what motivated you to partner up with GlobeScan to conduct this survey, of which the results I will share with you over the next half hour or so. We'll save some time for question and answers, of course. And then if you could introduce Stu Hart, who needs no introduction, I suspect, but we're really thrilled that Stu could join us. Paula.
Sure. So hello, everyone. As Eric said, I'm heading the Business Call to Action. For those who don't know us, this is we're a leading global platform that brings together companies across sizes and sectors and regions who are committed to contributing to development solutions through inclusive business. We are an alliance that is supported by the governments of the UK, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, and we are hosted by UNDP, by the United Nations Development Programme. So every year, BCtA does a member survey, and we do it in order to understand how companies are progressing on their inclusive business journey. And this is something that we also use to inform our own service offering to our members, but it has never been a public document. And this year, we thought that it would be very valuable, to bring back a lot of those insights to our membership and to others. We thought it would be great to conduct a broader survey, reaching a wider group of companies and stakeholders, and also just to inform the collective work that we are all trying to do in advancing this field of inclusive business. We decided to do it with GlobeScan because, it's really a leading company in this type of research and insights analysis, and they also have a very good grasp and a very good understanding of sustainability and sustainable business. And one of the things that we thought was very valuable is that it really captures the insights and the perceptions from the companies, who are really the ones that are, at the end of the day, they're the ones that are implementing the inclusive businesses. They're experiencing firsthand what it takes and how to go about it. So we really are thrilled that today we are joined by Professor Stuart Hart from the University of Vermont. He is really one of the world's top authorities on sustainable and inclusive business. He is the Stephen Grossman Endowed Chair in Sustainable Business and of the University of Vermont, and the co-founder of the School Sustainable Innovation MBA program. And he's also the president and the founder of Enterprise for a Sustainable World. So we couldn't be in better hands. He is going to share his reflections on the findings of this survey and perhaps also reflect on the way forward. So Stu, over to you. And thank you for joining us.
Oh, Paula, thank you so much for that. And Eric, delighted to be with you all. As Paula mentioned, I'm involved with this new MBA program at the University of Vermont, the Sustainable Innovation MBA, which is focused on pretty much our topic today. How do we get to tomorrow's sustainable and inclusive business? That's the focus of the entire MBA program. But I've also been involved for the last 20 years or so, going back to this piece that C.K. Prahalad and I wrote, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, and in both trying to facilitate, the emergence of base of the pyramid or inclusive business, but also kind of track it and understand it. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the results and offering whatever perspective I can. So thank you for having me. That's
great, Stu. Good to hear. We have a pretty tight agenda today. I'll begin with a little bit of background about the survey and its methodology. And then we'll kind of lay down a synopsis of the current state of sustainable business as surmised by our informed respondents. We'll look at how they see the benefits, both to their own enterprises and also to society. And then we'll take a look at some of the challenges from an ESG management point of view, and also from the realities of running a day-to-day business in a very competitive world, often in very challenging conditions. However, this is not just a monologue. This is a conversation we're hoping to get to. We will reserve time at the end for some discussion and question and answers. So we encourage all of you to submit your questions using the Q&A function within this Zoom webinar platform. In your control panel, either at the bottom or the top of your screen, you will see a button that says Q&A. You can click on there and type your questions directly into that, and then we'll go through those and that we can get to, and I'll direct them to our panelists, Paula and Stu as well, and we'll follow up with ones that we don't get to afterwards by email. The first question we will undoubtedly receive is, will the slides be available following the webinar? And the answer to that is yes, they will be sent to you via webinar, along with the fuller report, which BCtA and GlobeScan have published today, and Paula's written a great blog. And there's some infographics out there, so we encourage you to access these and do use them freely. We are going into the public domain. Okay, let's first talk a little bit about who we heard from in our survey of almost 200 people working in the community of inclusive business and sustainability. BCtA has a growing membership of companies who have committed to inclusive business and are operational within that field. And GlobeScan has a really broad network built up over 30 years of work in this space of experts and practitioners across multiple sectors. So with a focus on BCtA's ecosystem of practitioners, and with a little bit of draw on the expertise from outside the business sector, we put together a sample of 200 who graciously took time to reply to our surveys. Many of them will be on the line now, so a direct thank you to you for your partnership and collaboration. When we break this down, we find that the majority of our respondents are in companies, and there's a pretty good mix and distribution across different sectors. There's a little bit of a focus on food and ag, as that's a key and effective place for the development of inclusive businesses. We've got a pretty good mix of multinationals as well as small and medium-sized enterprises who are really rooted in this. It's their raison d'etre in inclusive business, and a smaller tranche of national companies, large national enterprises. Our respondents are fairly senior in their organizations. The strong majority are sort of VP and C-suite or board and up, as well as director levels. So we're pretty confident this is a fairly informed audience that we've got here. So with that, we'll just begin with the lay of the land, so to speak, and we asked some questions about practitioners' sort of assessment of where we are in the progression of inclusive business generally. The first question we asked is your company currently engaging in an inclusive business? Just to give us a little reality check on who we were hearing from the survey. And 3/4 of them said, yes, they're currently engaged. A small number said, not yet, but we're in the process of getting that going. There is a tranche of people who are not engaged in inclusive business, but planning to, but the vast majority are engaged. And we use this question to direct different lines of questioning to different audiences to make sure that the findings were relevant. And I should point out that these results are based on the subgroup of people who are in the private sector in working in companies. The next question we asked is, how strong is your company's commitment to advancing inclusive business? And we see some real passion, I think, that leap out here from these findings, where almost 80% of our inclusive business participants say they're deeply dedicated to it. Some are kind of a little bit in the middle, and there's a small number who probably feel in a frustrated way that their company's commitment is fairly weak. Not surprisingly, members of Business Call to Action report a stronger commitment to advancing IB. We see a strong correlation with the effectiveness and engagement and even success of inclusive business, according to whether or not our respondents are part of the BCtA coalition. Our next finding speaks to, among those who say that their company hasn't integrated IB across all functions in the enterprise, we ask them, well, what do others think in your company? How much value how do others in the enterprise view your inclusive business? And almost all say it's either adding some value, or 40% almost who say that the inclusive business initiatives are adding significant value. So our respondents are committed, and they see that inclusive business is a really good thing for their enterprise. And not only that, we see that there's some momentum. When we asked what stage of inclusive business development our respondents are feeling in their organizations, we see that half say they are scaling up, and another quarter say their inclusive businesses are growing slowly. Some are rolling out, and a few are piloting. So there's some growing momentum here in terms of the trajectory of inclusive business. Finally, we asked all respondents, everyone, whether or not they're in companies or not, how they've sensed engagement in inclusive business globally over the past 3 years has changed. Has it increased, stayed the same, or decreased? And we see that nearly 70% of our respondents sense that inclusive business has grown. There's been more engagement, more excitement, and about 22% stayed the same. Very few are sensing a slowdown or a decreased level of engagement over the past 3 years. And our company respondents are a little bit more likely to see an increase in inclusive business, but even the other respondents outside of the private sector, 2/3 of them see inclusive business having increased. So in sum, then, we see a really strong commitment to inclusive business among this group that we heard from. They think that it's adding value to their companies. We see that it's scaling up, and we see an increasing engagement over time. And Stuart, I'd like to ask you, with your observation and your long body of work in this field, is this a reality that you've picked up? Would you say that the glass is half full or half empty when it comes to the evolution of inclusive business?
Yeah, I think that this sort of would be consistent with just my own experience, which is decidedly biased toward working with companies that are in this space. But I guess what I would see is that if we go back, say, to the early 2000s, there was a sort of an uptick in activity around kind of business and base of the pyramid in the early going. Most of it, I would say, was taking kind of some version of current product and taking cost out and trying to then market to the further down the income pyramid. So I think there was kind of a wave going back 15 years ago, which didn't really meet with all that much success. And then I think there was a bit of a pause, that there was stock taking and learning that was going on, that serving the underserved and thinking about business at the base of the pyramid and inclusive business was probably going to take more than just taking cost out of current products and getting extended distribution. And then starting maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, I think we see now another wave of activity, and now meeting with more success. And of course, the world has changed over the last 20 years as well, and I can reflect on that a little bit further in. But I think we're now in a kind of a second wave of much more thoughtful, better thought through, sort of with more capability and with more staying power, and also more realistic in terms of what it takes and the time frame to be successful.
Very good. Thanks for that, synopsis on the evolution of inclusive business. The next question we asked people pertain to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. We asked them, how much do you think that the SDGs have influenced companies' decisions to engage in inclusive business initiatives in general, just generally? And we asked everyone this question, not just the business folks who participated in our survey. And we see a pretty large impact. 43% say the SDGs have really helped inclusive business to grow. A third see sort of a middling ground, with only 22% respond that the SDGs are relevant, have had no impact on the inclusive business agenda whatsoever. There's an interesting difference between people and companies, though, versus other respondents, and they feel the impact of the SDGs acutely. A much stronger sense of SDGs having a large impact. So, in a way, a bit of a beacon, perhaps. And Paula, you are working very closely with the SDG agenda. In fact, it's sort of part of the origin of the Alliance. What's your sense? Would we be in the same place today without that vision articulated by the 17 SDGs in 2015?
I mean, I think an inclusive economy is a material topic for business, regardless. But in many ways, I think that the SDGs have been able to bring together this complex set of risks and opportunities that are threatening our societies and the ones in which businesses can succeed. And in that sense, what we've seen is that, yes, the SDGs have had an important influence in how business understands and plays an active role in delivering these value to society through their business models, through their corporations. In very practical terms, in fact, we've seen that our membership base has doubled since the launch of the SDGs. And it's a conversation that we have with companies as they engage with us in their application process and so on. And what we see is that it's almost as an aha moment where they see inclusive business as a very concrete approach for engaging in this 2030 agenda and staying true to the principle of leaving no one behind. It's always hard to say, well, if they were not here, would it be something else? Evidently, the trends are there and the SDGs are based on those trends. But I think they've just done a very good job at packaging it together and recognizing the explicit role of business in delivering the agenda.
That's great, and after all, some quite robust work has shown that achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030 represents a $12 trillion business opportunity for business. Hard to get your head around that kind of on the one hand success potentially, and the value. But so what? How is inclusive business benefiting the businesses themselves and also society at large? Are we making a difference, essentially? First question we asked of all respondents is what was their sense on how inclusive business models are lifting people out of poverty and fighting inequality? And 70% almost think inclusive business can have a large influence on that in a positive way, and 17% are sort of in the middle. A few are skeptical, but nobody's really on the fence. Nobody says, I don't know, I can't answer that question. And naturally, of course, corporate respondents are much more enthusiastic and bullish about the impact that inclusive business models can have. But we asked this next question in terms of, well, what about your business? How significant would you say that the impact of your inclusive business initiatives has been in terms of improving the lives of low-income communities, and people in inclusive business are seeing results? 3/4 say their inclusive business has had a significant positive impact. 8% say no, it's not really that significant. But if you look at the breakout again, as to the same question, whether people are members of BCtA or non-members, the BCtA members are almost unanimous in that their inclusive business is having a positive impact. So if you're not already part of the coalition, this is a proof point which should encourage you to join in the movement. What about for the companies themselves? What are the benefits of inclusive business to the enterprise itself? The question we asked was, how does your company benefit as a result of your inclusive business initiatives? And we gave them a long list of different beneficial attributes, and we asked them to select the 3 where they think that their business benefits the most. And interestingly, the most frequently selected benefit of IB was intangible. We know intangible brand values are increasingly valuable. Reputation is essential for resiliency and for trust. And so people pick that most often. 57% say brand equity and reputation are the biggest benefits to their business from being an inclusive business. However, there's many more tangible benefits selected as well. So access to new markets and new customer segments. This isn't all about self-interest. It's very fundamental to the growth of companies. Competitive advantage, differentiation, the 3rd most frequently selected, and supply chain sustainability, resilience, also up there. So there are real benefits resulting from having inclusive businesses. Now, Stu, you teach in business schools and have taught in several. Do you get a similar sense from this? What other inclusive business benefits do you think are out there for companies to grab onto?
Yeah, I mean, I think these results are, again, are reflective of the evolution of the whole idea of inclusive business and based on the pyramid. That in the early days, I think it was seen as an expansion opportunity, right? A new source of potential profits, right? And I think that that license to operate was a big factor in the early days, and it's telling now that you see those rating, more close to the bottom, in terms of the primary benefits to the companies, and that much more important are bigger and more important payoffs like brand and reputation and the creation of new markets and innovation, right, and differentiation. Mm-hmm. But to me, this is reflective of the realization that to be successful, it means that you have to bring more in terms of, I think the idea that inclusive business is having an impact on poverty and inequality in the communities in which they operate. I mean, that's an empirical question at some level, but the fact that companies see that as an important element of their business means they're thinking in broader terms than just selling cheap products, right? That this is really about bringing wider value propositions that serve and lift at the same time. The result being, the payoff to the companies is longer term, based more around reputation, new market creation, competitive advantage, and less toward short-term profitability, expansion opportunities, and just, license to operate.
Very good. Thank you, Steve. Reminder here, just as we switch to the next section, please do submit any questions or thoughts you may have for discussion through the Q&A button, which is located in your control panel. You can type them right in there, and we'll be able to see them, and I can direct those to our panelists. Now, it's not all roses. There are many challenges involved in growing inclusive businesses, and we wanted to take a look at that too. So one question we asked was, what are the most important barriers to success, to the growth of your inclusive business? We asked that to people who are currently engaging in inclusive business, and we asked a slightly different question, obviously, to those who are not engaging in inclusive business. And then those are respectively reflected by the blue and the orange bars on this slide. And we see, I think, the impact of very different experiences. The rank order of how respondents kind of prioritize the barriers that they face is quite different. So for those who are currently engaging in IB, it's all about finance, difficulty in getting the funding they need to get off the ground. Whereas for people who are not currently engaged in inclusive business, there's a sense of this misalignment between the commercial and social impact expectations. In other words, still this paralyzing sense of trade-off that you can't have both at the same time. The perception of having insufficient internal capacity or capabilities, that interestingly there's less difference there. That's still a reality for people who are engaging in inclusive business, and even among those who are not, they sort of sense it to the same degree. I also find it interesting that the difficulty in developing competitive and quality products that are accessible is less of a barrier in the eyes of the people who have been there and done that. That is, those who are engaging in inclusive business. Those who haven't yet are much more likely to think that product development is a big barrier. And then this also sort of the knowledge of stakeholders and the audience and the market among low-income populations, very different perceptions there as well. So I think a takeaway from this slide is that those who are having success and working hard at their inclusive businesses really do need to engage other companies who have yet to take that step, who may have yet to see that opportunity, and try to align on some of this. And I think Business Call to Action is well positioned to help advance that even further. Next question is more from an ESG point of view, and we want to talk about risks, and we see in terms of how they rank different ESG risks in terms of the risks that they pose to their inclusive businesses. We see that unfavorable government relations are regulations, that is, are a sticking point for people. And we have the impact of climate change on low-income communities, which are often the market, of course, for inclusive business offers. We see disruption from technology also seen as a significant risk. But gender is less so in terms of inequality, as is scarcity of results. And I'd love to get Stu's perspective on this. Is this your sense as well? What can be done about this barrier sensed by unfavorable government regulations, and what might be some of those inhibiting regulations that might pose a risk to inclusive business? What's your advice?
Yeah, well, if I go back and also reflect on the previous slide, right, which you showed, which I think is really interesting, that and the takeaway from the previous slide for me is that familiarity, this one, that familiarity or lack thereof really changes perceptions, right? That not when you're viewing this idea of inclusive business from a distance, when you haven't really been directly involved, then you tend to overestimate, right, how big of a difference it's going to be, how much it's going to take, how much of a divergence this is between our current business and what this, kind of the serving the underserved would be. You see that rather clearly here, and for those that have experience, the foreboding nature of it is significantly diminished, and it really then you face up to the harsh realities that even within existing corporations, the project finance system is still not designed, for patient capital and so forth. And so you see the sort of more realistic sources of the difficulties having to do with financing and having the internal capability to really make it happen, which then kind of leads to that next slide that you showed, around regulation and so forth. If you go to that one, and I guess the way I would interpret that is that for many businesses that are looking to really step out and develop new business models, often bringing new technologies that would serve the underserved and would would also serve and lift, right? Address inequality through the business. That sometimes this is more of a problem, I would say, at the top of the pyramid and in current serve markets, but sometimes, kind of being a disruptive innovator is hindered by existing regulation, that it simply makes it more difficult. There are sources of blockage, right, that are involved. And then this whole issue about climate change, I think, I guess I would interpret these results in part from, the sample. You have a heavy sample drawing from from agriculture, food and beverage, which are being, impacted by climate change, right? The very act of growing food and agriculture as an industry is being impacted seriously by climate change. Now, I think in other industries, you can also turn that on its head and say that's an enormous opportunity. Addressing, kind of climate resilience and adaptation is a business opportunity, especially in the base of the income pyramid in coastal communities that are most threatened and so forth. But I would read this as these kinds of challenges around regulations often serve to make it more difficult to innovate, right? That's clearly the case at the top, and increasingly so in inclusive business, where I think, the communities themselves are, over time, and I'll reflect on this in your kind of your next section, the very nature of the base of the income pyramid has changed, over the last 20 years, and I'll speak more to that.
Great. Well, so those are the risks, and we were curious to what extent people in inclusive business were managing the risks that they ranked as very significant to them. And this is the hierarchy to the extent to which people said that they are managing them as a high priority versus sort of a moderate priority or a low priority. And we see a different rank order here. So gender inequality among the IB team, that's actively managed, very front and center. The impact of technology advances and disruption, eyes are on that. That's being managed as well. And also gender inequality among low-income communities that they're being served too. So inclusive business is strategically shaped around some of those dynamics. Unfavorable government regulations is less actively managed, which is interesting given that was the top ranked obstacle. Scarcity of natural resources, human rights across IB, impacts of climate change on low-income communities. And so when you chart these two questions that we just looked at, which is the degree to which these factors were posing risks to inclusive business versus the extent to which practitioners were actively managing these risks, we kind of see an inverse correlation here too. We see unfavorable government regulations as a very significant risk, but not necessarily being managed actively, and gender inequality, the reverse. It's down in the bottom right. So this is curious. Either businesses are effectively managing it, so they no longer see these dynamics as a risk, or it could be that some of these risks are sort of beyond control and insurmountable. So an interesting negative correlation here. And Stu, I wonder if you had further thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it on the head there. I think this has everything to do with locus of control, right? And that when it comes to gender inequality and the importance of elevating women and girls, that's something that inclusive businesses can focus on and build into their business models, right? And make it part of what the business is all about, and do that rather directly. And we know that has a positive development implication. So that's something within the locus of control of the companies themselves, versus climate change and unfavorable government regulations. Much more kind of challenges when it comes to regulation, perhaps, that you innovate around, right? That there's much less direct control there, especially in a developing world context, and that climate change is happening, and it's a question of how do you adapt to it, right? And it may be that, again, some businesses are directly impacted by it, like agriculture. For others, whether it's those in, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or in other industries, it's an opportunity, right, to figure out how to adapt to climate change without further destroying the climate. So I would interpret this as having everything to do with locus of control.
Very good. And in terms of locus of control, we also took a look at some more operational dimensions and asked to what extent the inclusive businesses are implementing a number of different measures. And I think in an enlightened sense, it's interesting to find that systematic engagement with stakeholders to inform decision making really is seen as a priority here and is being implemented well. We know that systematic stakeholder engagement is fundamental for building trust and also developing markets and sort of being part of an ecosystem, an economic ecosystem, but also a social ecosystem is really important to success. Technology, of course, a major driver. People are effectively implementing practices around integrating innovative technology. From a management point of view, there's also formalized accountability and oversight. There is some investment in R&D and new products, as Stu spoke about, innovation, getting the right people. All of these are seen to be fairly effectively implemented by the inclusive businesses who responded to this question. But what does this get you? Here's the kind of the last slide I want to show you on this, and this one's a multivariate analysis here. So what we wanted to know is the kinds of things that inclusive businesses were doing, which of those are really driving the commitment and the passion of the inclusive business that they report in another question. So these are straight ahead correlation results, with the dependent variable being that degree of commitment that we looked at earlier. And we see that the most powerful of organizational commitment to inclusive business is really around the people. It's about the ability to recruit and the right people and develop the right team and keep them on board. And it's also about compensating them. So that's obviously one of the biggest challenges. Both of those are really big challenges. While they really drive commitment, inclusive businesses seem to need more help in this space. Where inclusive businesses are having great success and some good leverage in the top right corner here is around that stakeholder engagement I mentioned, but also the accountability and the oversight and the sort of that systematization. Innovative technologies and management of disruption are a little less important, and so on. So again, it's about your people. I think really important, and I want to end there, and I just asked Stu if he had any thoughts before I ask him another question.
Yeah, I mean, we have met the enemy, and the enemy is us, right? That I think it's fascinating that companies, especially those that are engaged, have found it easier to include external voices, right? And it's enormously important, right, to reach out and engage external voices, stakeholder voices, in order to incorporate that into an effective business model. And that for existing companies, it's easier for the companies to build that into their strategy process than it is to reform the internal systems themselves, right? That measure people, that recruit people. And again, I think that passes the test of face validity. That for most companies, it's the internal systems are like an immune system, and something that looks different, is an invader, and should be surrounded by antibodies and killed, versus the ability to kind of get outside the company, out into the community. It's fascinating that it's easier for companies to build that on versus kind of challenging the internal systems themselves that make it more difficult to innovate.
Very good. And to wrap up our kind of dialogue here, Stu, I did want to ask to think ahead 5 years from now, and wondering what you would hope to find in terms of results to a similar survey, and what would you actually expect to find 5 years from now, rather, if we conducted the survey again then.
Yeah. So I'm working on a piece right now that's the title of which tentatively is the reckoning at the middle of the diamond. And what do I mean by that? I mean, so if we go back in time to the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, 20 years ago, the world was a pyramid, right? That the 2/3 of humanity was, at the base of the income pyramid, earning less than $4 or $5 a day per capita. But that has changed rather dramatically over the last 20 years. And if we look out to 2030, the majority of people will be in the middle of the diamond. The world is becoming a diamond, and the vast majority of people will be in the middle of the diamond. Strictly from an income point of view, not that income is the best or only measure of poverty. But I think what it's reflective of is the dramatic reduction in extreme poverty, right, over the last 20 years. And, hopefully the continuation of that it becomes and is increasingly tragically becoming primarily an African problem. And that our challenge looking out 5 years is how to stem the flow of people from rural areas into rapidly urbanizing megacities with, attendant urban slums and shantytowns. And then, the real inclusion, the real inclusion challenge and opportunity becomes increasingly urban, right? And with people with rising incomes, where we have to address kind of burgeoning megacities, with rising aspirations for consumption and environmental degradation that goes along with that. So I guess I look out 5 years and I think that inclusive business really is business, right? I mean, and if the SDGs are a driver, and I think they are, that becomes perhaps our biggest global challenge and opportunity, right? Is how do we fulfill the needs and aspirations of the rising middle class that's becoming increasingly urban, without continuing to degrade natural systems and destroy the climate in the process.
Mm-hmm. Very good and very fundamental, I think. A reminder to everyone on the line that please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function in the control bar on your screen. And we'll take a few now, as is often the case in these things when we share survey results. Our first question that came in early on was this, and Maria Isa is pointing out some perceived sample bias because participants chose to participate in the survey, therefore they're not really engaged or interested in inclusive business. Only those who are would participate in the survey. And yes, Isa, that is correct, but it was also the intention. Our interest is to really capture a portrait of what's going on in the inclusive business field. What can we learn from? But then also to bring in a little bit of perspective from those not engaged in inclusive business, a smaller sample, yes, but also those outside of the corporate sector. And so we've got a snippet of them too, and you'll be able to delve into more of the findings in the report that was released today as well. So please do submit your questions. Here's another one from Deborah Dunning, which I'll direct towards Stu, because I think it's an important one. And she asks, how do you distinguish between the circular business model and the inclusive business model and goals? Stu, how would you describe the difference there?
Well, I mean, I think increasingly both of those ideas need to be integrated together, right? That perhaps, again, if we look back, there was a distinction to be made between base of the pyramid or inclusive business fights poverty, versus, circularity and environmental sustainability, that was, historically seen as something for rich people, right? And rich people worry about green and environment, and, an inclusive business is really about fighting poverty and inequality. And again, if we go back to my comment I just made about how the world is changing, we can ill afford to have those be separate tracks. That increasingly inclusive business has to be based on a circular economy model, on an environmentally sustainable business model, or else, you know, the SDGs have no hope of being achieved.
Mm-hmm. And that ties very clearly and even brings to life more your comments about the changing shape of the pyramid and the diamond.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question for Paula, if you would, and that is from Rolf Schinkel, who asks, assuming that inclusive business is part of the core business, then what could cause insufficient financing to be one of the big barriers inclusive businesses are facing, as we found in the results we've just shared? Paula?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a couple of possible whys to it. The first one is inclusive business does require patience, and it does require investment in order to then become, profitable. So that what we've seen is that sometimes companies manage to pilot and to do initiatives that are successful, but they don't necessarily attract enough financing to continue investing and growing and replicating. But the other one is that a lot of the respondents were also SMEs or social enterprises. And in that case, these as well are companies that are trying to attract more investors in order to allow them to go deeper or broader.
Excellent. Here's another question, as we have a little bit more time. Marilyn Friedman asks, what are some of the best of class examples of inclusive business initiatives in developed economies like Canada and the US? Stu, you and I are here. You're much more closer to the field than I am. So I'd love to direct that towards you. But before I do that, I would like to point out that the inclusive businesses we surveyed tend to be distributed outside of Europe and North America. And so that really is where the focus is. But it's a good question. Who in North America might we learn from, given that the UK seems to be further ahead, in Marilyn's opinion?
So I'm just trying to understand that I interpret the question correctly. I mean, one interpretation is what are the best in class examples of IB initiatives in these places, right? In other words, inclusive business focused on the US and Canada.
Mm-hmm. That's how I read the question.
Yeah, versus US based companies involved in inclusive business in Africa or Asia or Latin America. So again, I think that there is a certain tragic quality to this, you know, speaking as an American, that that base of the pyramid is growing in the US. Right? So I think increasingly companies, especially larger companies, but I think SMEs too, that you know, historically when they thought about base of the pyramid or inclusive business, naturally thought about the developing world, increasingly now realize that there is a major challenge and opportunity right at home. So, you know, when you think about the deindustrialized cities of the industrial Midwest, and, you know, and that of course has public sentiment and political implications as well, and as it does in the UK and throughout the world. You know, I find it interesting that more and more companies, the JP Morgan Chases of the world, right, that have made a significant investment in Detroit, for example, that you have urban agriculture and vertical farming, that you have increasingly a focus on plant-based proteins, right, and with, you know, a number of innovators in that space. Now, that is also going to have major implications in the rapidly rising cities of the you know, emerging economies as well. That, you know, there's more and more attention to you know, circular economy in, you know, the industrialized world. How do we build take-back infrastructures to ensure that we get beyond just beverage containers? And, you know, so there's several interesting initiatives in inclusive waste recycling, for example. So we could go down the list that you know, I think there are more and more companies that realize that inequality and inclusion in places like the US and in Western Europe become increasingly important, and offer up challenges and business opportunities as a result.
Excellent. And we have a question that segues nicely from that, and it really does speak to some of the nuance. And here it is. A attendee to this webinar points out that inclusive businesses do not serve only the base of the pyramid, but also serve the base of the pyramid as part of their core activities. And my question is, where do you draw the line? If, for instance, 40% of my customers are within the base of the pyramid segment, am I an inclusive business? It's not a black and white or a binary thing, is it, in terms of how we define inclusive business, Stu?
No, not at all, not at all. So I think in terms of this, your sample, right, that you have a number of probably companies in the SME segment for whom inclusion is the business, right? That they were, we'll call it born BOP, right? That their focus is on developing a business model to serve and lift the underserved. But for existing incumbent firms, obviously that's not the case, right? So for existing incumbent firms, the majority of their market is now and will remain for some time the established markets closer to the top of the pyramid, for whom inclusive business therefore is a new initiative, is sort of building out a new platform within the company for the future, right? So I would agree that it really depends on how established the company is, the extent to which a company is engaged in inclusive business. It becomes a new initiative, a new growth platform, versus a much newer company or a focus company for whom inclusive business is the business.
Excellent. And Paula, I mean, you head up an organization that is membership based in some ways, based on commitments and such, and it consists of inclusive businesses. Do you confront this question of either or versus to what extent? Who is an inclusive business, what is not? Could you speak to that a little bit from BCTA's perspective?
Sure. I mean, I fully agree with Stu's point, and it's definitely not black or white. I think some of the characteristics that we look into what we consider credible inclusive businesses are one, that they are linked to the core operations. Two, that they do have the intent of benefiting and including the base of the pyramid segment. Three, that the quality of that engagement, has to bring in those attributes of affordability, quality, adequacy, and accessibility, right? In a way that responds to the needs of the market, and we look at the potential for scale as well. So those are the characteristics that we look at, and yes, it's not a binary yes or no. You just need to look at the full package and the maturity of the company as they go about implementing these initiatives.
Excellent. And Godegard, apologies if I mispronounced your name, but you ask, how do you see the trends of private sector and governments partnering on understanding what it takes to do inclusive business? I suppose what it takes for inclusive businesses to succeed. And so this gets at the importance and the dynamics and challenges involved in partnership. And Maria Issa adds, pointing out that this systematic engagement with governments and public policy by companies could help reduce that government regulation barrier. Any thoughts on trends in that area, Stu?
Yeah, I mean, I just returned I was in Denmark last week, small country, but just a very genuine commitment and partnership between the private sector and the national government and even municipal governments, right? So I think in parts of Western Europe, especially Northern Europe or Japan, right? I think you see a coming together, right? That the private sector and governments are increasingly joining forces to spawn the sort of innovative new business and market and new technology development that's going to be required to really have an impact when it comes to lifting the base of the income pyramid. that isn't a universal trend, however. I'm not sure that that's happening in the US right now. But things change, but I think there is enormous room. I mean, in a sense, governments ought to take the lead, right? That perhaps one of the reasons why the whole notion of business and the base of the income pyramid, inclusive business, why that has become a trend line in general is because governments have perhaps not fulfilled their role.
Great. And here's an interesting question that I think follows the discussion quite nicely. And this gets at what advice might you have for those working in large companies, but in which inclusive business is sort of marginalized or not gaining much momentum? What advice would you give to those people who are probably deeply committed and passionate, but perhaps frustrated a little bit? How can we help them grow the scale of inclusive business internally?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the key to this is that you can have agency from where you sit, right? That, in other words, it is possible, if you're a committed change maker, to build a change coalition from within, right? That it can happen, it does happen, it is happening. That it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's driven by the C-suite. That some of the most interesting innovations have come from the bottom up, and it's a matter of being kind of persistent, capable, and persuasive from where you sit, wherever it might be. If you're in R&D or in product development or in marketing, that it is possible to kind of build a change coalition, and I mean, this comes straight from the innovation literature, right? That innovations are often launched, classic cases like 3M, right? Just coming from the bottom up.
That's wonderful inspiration for us, and I think really does speak to the importance of the work you're doing at the Sustainable Innovation MBA program at Grossman School. So thank you for that. Paula, we're just about out of time. Final thoughts to you.
No, I mean, listen, first of all, to thank you and Stu. This is a fantastic conversation. A quick thought, maybe back to the government point, and to one of the questions that Chris from Ivan was posing. And as much as I do think there's a shift in the mindset, I do believe that there's still quite a bit of a gap in the trust between government and the private sector and business. And it's an area for those listening that are, networks that are helping build this field. I think that is definitely an area where we can contribute and we can help to facilitate that constructive dialogue in a more systematic way. I think it has to go broad and it has to go deep, because at the end of the day, it comes down to specific sectors and specific policies and coherence in those policies. So I think that that is also a shout out to those that are contributing to building that space as well.
Well, great, wonderful contributions, Stu. Thank you so much, and Paula, from you, thank you for taking the initiative to have this research done. We're hopeful that we can do it again and get some longitudinal time series going and be back in a year or two. To share again. Thank you to everyone who was able to tune in today. A reminder that you shall receive the slides by email, as well as links to other pieces associated with the survey. Have a good rest of your day, a good night, and thank you for joining. Bye-bye.